Hello everyone, welcome to our little midweek harbour mini. As promised, this is the third in my little messages based on or looking at the word covenant. And I just need to clear up one little thing from my first talk when I watched it again. I got my covenants muddled up when I spoke about the signs of the covenants. If you remember, I said that when God made a covenant in the Old Testament, he always gave a sign with it. And the covenant God made with Abraham was the covenant in which circumcision was the sign and not that of Moses. But in my defence, it is all rather confusing, certainly because by the time we get to the New Testament and the New Testament letters of Paul, he associates these two covenants very closely together. And he says in Galatians 5:3 that if anyone allows himself to be circumcised, he's obliged to keep the whole law. So they were closely knit together. But just to be clear, they are different signs, and I'll go through those in a moment. And in fact, this sort of mistake has prompted me to look a little bit closer at this whole idea of the sign in the Old Testament. And it's actually a really important concept, really important word, as we'll see, and it comes from this Hebrew word out, really the best explanation of what a sign is given by the Bible itself. In Isaiah 38 verse 7, it says, "This is the Lord's sign to you, that the Lord will do what he has promised." So it's quite simple really. A sign was just an indicator that God would be true to his word. And we've already touched upon a number of covenants in the Old Testament. Most famous one, of course, is the covenant, sometimes called the Mosaic covenant, which happened after the flood, when God promised that he would no longer flood the world. He put a rainbow in the sky, and that rainbow was a reminder of the covenant, a sign of the covenant that God made, and that affected all life on earth. The second covenant we looked at was that of Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, and that was really a covenant with a man and his family and the descendants of that man, and the promise was that he would know blessing and that his descendants would be blessed, and in fact the nations would be blessed through this man. And the sign of that covenant, as I've said, was circumcision. The third covenant which I mentioned was that of Moses, the Mosaic covenant. And this really was a covenant with a people, with a community. And this is where I made my error, because the sign of the Mosaic covenant wasn't circumcision, but actually, quite surprisingly, is mentioned as being the Sabbath. In Exodus 31 verse 13, it says, "Say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy." So this Mosaic covenant was accompanied by this sign of the keeping of the Sabbaths, which was a promise that God would make his people holy, which I thought was really interesting. But there are two other covenants I want to look at very quickly and briefly. Could obviously spend a lot longer on these, but they're two very important covenants, and they both concern Jesus Christ. They both concern the coming of the Messiah. And the first of these covenants is known as the Davidic covenant, because it was the covenant made with King David. And you can read the covenant in Samuel chapter 7, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 11 to 13. This is what it says. "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." So this was a promise given to David by the prophet Nathan, that a king would come from his own line, that one of his sons would sit upon an eternal throne, an eternal kingdom. And it's an everlasting covenant, a perpetual covenant, and it's actually called a covenant of salt in 2 Chronicles 13 verse 5. "Don't you know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel to David and his descendants forever by a covenant of salt?" Which is a really curious phrase. You may have come across it, and the Hebrew is berit, melach. And there's quite a lot of thinking about why it's called a covenant of salt. But it's probably caught up with this idea of perpetuity, that this covenant would go on through the generations and has no fixed end. It lasts, because that's what salt does, it makes things last. But also in the ancient world, salt had a quite an interesting status, and there was an expression which was that if you shared your salt with someone, then you were in fellowship with that person. And in fact, there's a quote from Aristotle, which says, as the proverb says, men cannot know each other until they have eaten salt together. So there was this idea of sharing salt was a sign of friendship, a sign of fellowship. And of course, the whole backdrop to the meaning of the covenant is that this is the means through which God makes friends with humanity, that God is restored back to being in right relationship with human beings. But there's something I want to show you about the Davidic covenant, which is really interesting. We obviously know that the person being spoken about in the prophecy is David, but of course for those people on the other side of the cross, the other side of the coming of Christ, it perhaps wasn't as obvious, or as definitely wasn't as obvious, and they had to wrestle with the meaning of these texts before Christ came. And there's one thing that anyone studying the Old Testament, perhaps, I reckon they would have, perhaps there's one thing they would have noticed, which was that whereas the other signs already mentioned the other covenants already mentioned had a sign that went with them, the Davidic covenant didn't have a sign that went with it. It lacked a sign. And in fact, it lacked a sign for about 300 years. And we actually, in the end, get told what the sign is in a curious place. We get told in the book of Isaiah what this sign will be. And you can look the story up in Isaiah 7, and I've mentioned it before, that this is the moment when King Ahaz is on the throne of Judah, and they're about to be attacked, actually by the king of Israel and by the king of Aram. And God sends the prophet Isaiah to Ahaz to reassure him that the attack won't take place. And as part of that interchange, Isaiah says to Ahaz these words in Isaiah 7, verses 10 to 11. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. And Ahaz, for whatever reason, doesn't want to take Isaiah up on this offer, and perhaps he realised the gravity of what God was asking him, and he backs out. And then God says, through the prophet Isaiah, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. And so my point is that the sign of the Davidic covenant was going to be, according to Isaiah, I believe, the birth of a son born of a virgin, who would be known as God with us, Emmanuel. And this was the sign of the Davidic covenant. And in fact, as if to sort of confirm this, in Luke 2:12, at the birth of Christ, it says, this will be a sign to you. The angel speaking to the shepherds, this will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. So it's pretty amazing that this, David's covenant was going to be accompanied with the sign, with the birth of a child who would be in the line of Judah, in the line of the king. And in fact, the whole first section that makes up Isaiah, first Isaiah, from chapter 1 to 39, really centres around this idea of a coming king. All those very famous passages about the king that's going to come, wonderful counselor. They take up a lot of the emphasis, the prophetic emphasis of chapters 1 to 39 in Isaiah. But if that isn't amazing enough, there's something else, because there's a second covenant of salt that we find in the Old Testament. So the first covenant of salt is the Davidic covenant, but the second covenant of salt is found in Numbers 18. And if the Davidic covenant concerned the tribe of Judah and the line of Judah, and concerned kingship, then this covenant concerned the tribe of Levi, and it concerned the priesthood. It was a priestly covenant. And you can read it through in Numbers 18. It's quite an involved passage, but in essence, in short, the nature of the covenant that is explained in Numbers 18 really governed everything that happened in the temple, that God has set up this priesthood to whom people can bring their sacrifices and for the priest to administer. And of course these were Levites, and the Levites of course didn't have an inheritance in the land, but their inheritance was to receive the tithe, and they lived off the tithe, they ate the tithe. That was 1/10 of the sacrifices that were brought to them. And this was called the Perpetual Share. You can look at it in verse 8. It says, "Then the Lord said to Aaron, I myself have put you in charge of the offerings presented to me. All the holy offerings the Israelites give me, I give to you and your sons as your portion, your perpetual share." And in verse 19, "Whatever is set aside from the holy offerings the Israelites present to the Lord, I give to you and your sons and daughters as a perpetual share. It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord for both you and your offspring." So the Davidic covenant focused and centred on God's provision of a king. Here it centres on the provision of the high priest and the priesthood. And really the function of the high priest and the function of the priesthood was to divert judgment from the Israelites by offering sacrifice. And really in some ways the priesthood was like a formalisation of what happened at the Passover when the Israelites left Egypt. And they put the blood on the doorpost. They marked the doorpost and the lintel with blood as a sign that death should pass them by. And this whole motif of sacrifice and the lamb obviously inevitably and ultimately points to Christ. And in fact it's an interesting point that John the Baptist, whose father was Zechariah, who was ministering in the temple, when he has his vision and the prophecy concerning John the Baptist, it's interesting that John the Baptist was a Levite, and the job of the Levites was to really, they prophetically pointed out the coming of the Lamb, the coming need for sacrifice. And so when John said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," he was really speaking out of that prophetic Levitical voice that was his. But the other interesting thing about this covenant, this priestly covenant, or Aaronic covenant as it's sometimes called, is that it also lacked a sign. Nowhere does it say this was the sign of the covenant. And maybe you've begun to see this, that, as I mentioned, as the first half of Isaiah centres upon the Davidic coming of the Messiah, so the second half of Isaiah focusing on the coming of the suffering servant who would be sacrificed. Quite literally, that's the language that's used to speak of this coming servant, that he would be sacrificed vicariously for the sins of his people. And so if the sign of the first covenant, of the Davidic covenant was the birth of a son by a virgin, so the sign of the Aaronic or the priestly covenant was the coming death, the death of the servant on the cross. And I believe that the cross is the sign of this Aaronic covenant. And in fact Jesus himself, speaking of the end of the world, said that then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And it's like there's this sort of hinting at this is the sign that was missing, and the sign is the cross. And of course, I'm sure you know this, that even back in at the story of Exodus, when the Israelites leave Egypt, the mark that they put on the doorpost and the lintel would have made the shape of a tav, their last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which was originally the original Hebrew of that would have been a cross. So this symbol of the cross has been a sign that was going to appear at some point in the future when these words were first written down. And of course we know that Christ did come. Christ was born of a virgin, and he did go to the cross. to save his people from their sins. So I hope that's helpful, just to point out that there are these two other covenants, both of which speak of Christ and point to the coming of Christ. And there's a little bit extra which I'll fill you in on shortly.